Hello, everyone, and welcome to this evening's panel discussion in the Racism is Real dialogue series. Tonight's dialogue is particularly timely, as we all know, anti-Asian racism and COVID-19. My name is Regina Shan Stoltzfus, and I'm with Roots of Justice, an organization that provides trainings and consultation on dismantling racism, sexism, heterosexism, classism, and other forms of oppression. I will be moderating this evening's conversation. So now I would like to introduce you to our 5 panelists and give you a little bit of information on how we will be proceeding through this evening's conversation. Taehoo Lee was born in South Korea and moved to the United States in 1994 and settled in Philadelphia. He is an ordained minister with the Christian Reformed Church. Through his study and ministry experience, he was challenged by racial conflicts. In 2003, he moved to North Philly and became a neighbor to those living on the margins of society. Every year, he runs a summer camp during July in front of his home, and more than 100 children from the neighborhood benefit from it. He believes that the good news of Jesus of Nazareth is the only hope for his neighbors. Reverend Dr. Yuki Schwartz is the Associate Professor of Justice Formation at Keystone Congregational United Church of Christ and the Education Director at the Justice Leadership Program in Seattle and adjunct faculty in theology at Phillips Theological Seminary in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Dr. Schwartz's research includes U.S. imperialism and militarism, political theologies of race and racism, and U.S. histories of justice movements. Christianne serves as Fraser Region Community Justice Initiative's Training and Education Coordinator in British Columbia, Canada. She is an accomplished facilitator with expertise in a variety of practice models, including victim offender dialogue, family group conferencing, and peacemaking circles. Christianne is a longtime anti-oppression and anti-racism facilitator with the North Shore Multicultural Society and has established justice-related community initiatives in the North Shore. Sue Park Herr is the denominational minister for transformative peacemaking for Mennonite Church USA. She is also the co-director of a peace center in Los Angeles called ReconciliAsian, specializing in conflict transformation, restorative justice, and trauma healing for immigrant churches. And Richard Peralta is a St. Louis native, having lived and worked around the US, including Chicagoland, South Carolina, Colorado, Oregon, and Hawaii. With master's degrees in counseling and psychology, he has served in higher education and social justice for 15 years before recently relocating to the UK. Now a writer and actor, he's currently developing a social justice educational program for directors and producers while utilizing time in quarantine, counseling fellow creatives of color in the UK and in the US. Thanks to each of you for being with us for this very important conversation. We are planning for our conversation to last about an hour or so, and we will use the last 15 minutes or so to take questions. We will be taking questions from the chat box, so those of you who are listening in, please type your questions in there. We will try our best to get all of them in. Your mics are muted, so you will need to type those in and we'll make sure that they get to me. So thank you, panelists, for being with us tonight, and thank you so much for all of the people who are online with us listening in. This is a really important conversation, and it's wonderful to know that people are willing to have it. So panelists, the first question that I'd like for you all to answer is to just give the audience information about how you identify in terms of ethnicity and nationality.
I can go first. I
Yes.
don't hear anyone else. Yeah. Hi again, I'm Richard. Thanks again, everyone, for coming in to see us. Um, I identify as Filipino American, nationality American and British. And then my pronouns are he, him, and his.
Thank you.
I'll go next, I suppose. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for taking part in this very important discussion. My pronouns are siya, she, her. I identify as a Filipino immigrant settler, originally from the northern region of the Philippines, now living on the unceded ancestral and traditional lands of the Coast Salish people, otherwise known as British Columbia, Canada.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Sue Parker. You can refer to me. My ethnicity is Korean American, who's living in the territory of the Tongva people here in Los Angeles, and my pronouns are he and her.
Hi, my name is Yuki Schwartz, and I identify as Japanese American living in the Duwamish lands on the Salish Sea, and my pronouns are they, them.
Hi, I'm Taehoo Lee. I am still legal alien, living with a green card. So nationality-wise, I'm still Korean, but as a transplant from Korea, living in the Lenape land in Philadelphia. So, and he.
Thank you. Thank you all. It's a good reminder for us all to remember when we're talking about Asian anti-racism directed towards people of Asian descent. We are talking about lots of communities, lots of nationalities, lots of experiences, and within lots of contexts. And that's a helpful thing for us to carry forward. So my next question is to talk a little bit about how you, your families, and your communities have been observing, dealing with, addressing the effects of the current wave of violence that's coming about, particularly connected to the COVID-19 pandemic. What are the things that you are witnessing or hearing about or experiencing?
I can jump in there.
Thank you, Richard.
Yeah, so for me, even though I live in the UK, my parents and my brother are still in St. Louis. And so, especially someone who is raised in St. Louis, the racial divide of black and white mostly has had a big impact on my identity and how my family chooses to navigate race, specifically since the 70s. And so what my family has shared with me is that there has been an increase of violence targeted towards Asians, at least in the St. Louis area. But it's been more verbal. All three of my family members, my parents and my brother, they each work in separate hospitals, and to hear some hurtful language or even looks, tutting, sucking of teeth from even patients, all three of them at separate hospitals has been a challenge for them. And the community that they found support in is our Black family and community that can really support us and say, we get it, we feel you, we're here for you, we're showing up every day for you. Just let us know how we can help.
Oh, thanks.
I guess I can go following the order that we did our introductions.
Okay.
For me, a lot of what I've witnessed and heard about has been through the students, prior to the isolation, the students that I often would sit with in circles at the schools, there's been a lot more stories shared about increased racism of Asian Canadian students. And one of the things that really, I guess, have stayed with me is how this has also brought up and has elevated a lot of the the pre-existing stereotypes around Asians, and so that's come up in addition to COVID. I live in a small Tri-City community here in BC, and you know, I was hearing a lot of information around people were actually calling the mayor's office in my city, basically requesting for the city to ban any Asian Canadians to be coming into the city. And so there's been a lot of things like that. For myself, really nuanced interactions, like someone, you know, really getting very far out of the way in a very, very, you know, I want to say the actions are very obvious to me. And so it's been things like that that has indicated to me that there's an increase in views, anti-racist views towards Asians. But really, for me, what's been sitting with me is the experiences of students, and the fact that, you know, I'm speaking with grade 4s, 5s to 10s, and they're sharing just how much more racism they're experiencing now than before.
Thank you.
Well, this is Sue. I live in Los Angeles, where it's very diverse. We have a very high population of Asian Americans. And so it's very mixed depending on where you're at. I know some of the cities nearby, like Arcadia, if you're not wearing a mask, people stare at you because everyone should. You know, there's a normative that's different. Whereas I live in Pasadena, and this is where, I don't know if you've seen the coverage of Sima, the actor who was in, I think, Farewell and Tiger Tail. It was the Whole Foods. It's the city. That's the place where, you know, I don't shop there often, but I know exactly where that is. And he, as he was in the parking lot, somebody said, "You should be quarantined." There's this nuanced looks all the time, especially when we go to the grocery stores, that go beyond taking safe precautions. It's very evident. It's that microaggression that we felt before that's been augmented at this point. I think I have a mom who is 82 years old. She lives in a kind of a retired community, and it's really hit them hard. And I see that, and it really, that's been really heartbreaking. They see the fear has been augmented in their communities. They're already isolated and with limited resources, and the inaccessibility of being physically not being able to go out. That has also triggered a lot of mental anxieties, especially for my mom who has depression. Yes, we have a high percentage of Asian Americans who experience depression, as well as her chronic pain. And so I just feel very helpless seeing the elder community and the lack of accessibility and just not being able to help. And so there's a feeling of frustration and just, yeah, that I feel for our elderly.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you.
I can echo much of what I've heard so far, that there are even, so I live near Seattle, and which is a somewhat diverse population, but we have a large Asian population, Asian and Asian American population, and there are reports of the verbal harassment. A lot of the ones that I've heard about from friends have been people yelling at them on the street saying that you should, you know, go back to where you come from, that you're, you know, you're dirty, that it's your fault, things like that. I'm also hearing from people, especially on my online circles, of how often they report not wanting to go outside because they're afraid of being harassed. And I started thinking about how often that is like the design of these incidents. It's to make us afraid, that terrorism works in that way.
Mm-hmm.
And so many of my friends are reporting an uneasiness of going outside, of not wanting to do the shopping or to get it done as quickly as possible because they're afraid of having to have that experience and that trauma re-triggered. And then just the difficulty of being able to comfort one another when we're hearing about it, because we are so distant and separate from one another.
Mm-hmm. Wow, yeah, thank you.
Early in February, so when this COVID-19 was more of a kind of foreign thing, my friend went to a restaurant outside of Philadelphia, and the server took my friend's family into a separate room, which he didn't know that even existed, right? So he felt kind of good. Wow, never didn't know this existed. And when he was seated and settled in, kind of looked around, and he realized that every table in that separate room was occupied by Asian people.
Wow.
And not too long after reading about that, I went to Connecticut, outside of Hartford, and with another Korean friend of mine, we went to a pub, which is mostly, populated by white clients. The server said, wait a little bit, and then soon she took us to a booth, which was, again, isolated from the rest of the hall. And I wasn't sure whether it was intentional or not.
Mm-hmm.
And then later, when the kind of a call to take a shelter at home became norm, I haven't experienced anything in person, but I've been hearing my friends telling me, for example, hearing "go back to your own country" to physical aggression, or kind of getting a look. And so, been hearing a lot from my friends that they feel nervous to go for grocery shopping, and even to be out for a walk or run because of that.
Yeah, from you all's stories, it is clear that this is permeating all facets of life for people, and it's really helpful to have heard you all also talk about the different generations being affected and how they are affected, from small children to elderly people. I'm also really grateful for the geographical breadth that we have in this conversation, that you are representing many places on the globe, but saying very similar things about what you are witnessing and experiencing. Could some of you, or maybe all of you, if you would like to, talk a little bit about what you know about historical anti-Asian racism and how what is happening now fits in with that? I mean, you've opened the door to that a little bit, but are there some other things that you can say about the similarities or the connections between where we have been before historically and where we are now with this particular situation?
I'll jump in again. I don't want anyone to feel like we're stuck in this pattern, but
but if it's easier to be in the pattern, maybe that's what we should do.
Yeah, it's fine with me. Yeah,
okay,
so for me, I have overheard dialogue in public spaces about should Asian people be quarantined? And I went straight to what I first learned about internment camps, and it scared me. Granted, I live in the UK, but that doesn't mean I'm not always thinking about my family back home and my friends back home. What's interesting here is adjusting to the UK and its history with racism, specifically with Asian and East Asian people. Orientalism is something that I had to learn a lot about. I still go to grocery stores only because I have to, where the section of food is still called Oriental, where a lot of restaurants still call themselves Oriental. And being an American, to see it used so widely has been challenging for me. So to then hear dialogue in public about Oriental people makes it even more challenging. And so whilst there wasn't internment camps for Japanese here in the UK, for me, that mix of British history and American history, just it causes a new sense of anxiety almost, and what could happen next. I wasn't sure whether I was willing to admit this with the last question, but I too was afraid to go out for a while. And I finally did, and left the grocery store in tears. Like, I got to the car, my husband was there, he was mortified, said, "What just happened?" I said, "Let's wait till we get home, and just let me get these feelings out." So it's real. It's definitely real.
Yeah, thanks.
I was trying to break the pattern. From a Canadian context, particularly the province that I'm in, it has a long history of anti-Asian policies. Starting way back, there was a head tax applied to Asian immigrants. I think that was back in 1885. Then we had the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1923. There's actually written documents of a prime minister, is it Mackenzie King, who spoke, who actually expressed that Canada should remain racially pure, even if it impacted the economy badly. He was, I think, he was very much at the forefront of a lot of those policies being put in place. But it isn't just, I think, the Chinese community. In the 1990s, there was policy that cut off immigration from India as well. And then, of course, 1942, where Japanese Canadians were interned and their property sold at very low prices, and then essentially, taken and applied to their internment. And so all of this, I think, is coming up. And when I look back at that history, a lot of it was from public pressure. A lot of it was from white pressure out of fear. And so now it feels like that's happening again. And then, of course, I'm hearing both from just, in general, as well as, some of the dialogues that are happening around me, and it's these discussions around, you should ban immigration from, China. And so that's that history. And I don't know to what extent people are aware of that history when they're speaking about that, but I guess there's a fear and sadness for me about history repeating itself. And there's a lot of rhetoric around, justifying those ideas because of COVID-19. And I often say to some of the people I'm in conversation with, I said, I guess we'll see after COVID-19 whether that hate, you know, is something that's going to perpetuate, and whether COVID-19 is simply another, you know, another event to as a catalyst for perpetuating those ideas again. So.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to this pattern. But I mean, now Asians have been removed from the pedestal of being this model minority, and now we become the yellow peril again. We have the history here in California, right? The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, Filipino American laborers being discriminated in the 1920s and 30s. And here again, right in my backyard, the Japanese Americans being taken to Santa Anita racetrack, lined up and taken to these concentration camps during the war. Later on, Koreans, Laotians, Vietnamese, Cambodians, and we come and we are seen as dirty, demonized as the enemy. This is the history that we have been flipped back and forth all the time at the convenience of our white supremacist structure. We are either the yellow peril or the model minority, and to keep our stories simple. And it's just really disheartening to recognize that I live in California, and yet I don't get to see and hear really the history of all of this that happened on this state until much later in life. And so these stories are still hidden. These stories are still trying to be erased. And until we have, you know, people who are trying to preserve and keep records of all of this, there's this constant erasure of our history. And so that really impacts, I think, us and our generation and passing forward or past the next generation of my children. So yeah, this is nothing new. This is nothing new.
Yeah.
So I grew up in Oklahoma. I was born and raised in Oklahoma, and in the part of the state that was so-called Indian Territory, which is where the U.S. military, the U.S. government marched the Cherokee people into with the Trail of Tears. And so that was a large part of my history growing up in that area, of understanding this history of how the United States likes to get rid of the people who are in its way for economic reasons, for political reasons, whatever. And it's not just, I have been thinking a lot about internment, living here in the Pacific Northwest now, surrounded by the induction centers. I'm 20 miles from Puyallup, which has one of the racetracks where they house people from the Puget Sound area, for Japanese Americans in Puget Sound, who were later sent to the different internment camps across the country. And this is a theme that goes throughout our history in the United States. This is a US history of not just an Asian American history, it's a US history of containing that it's people that it will not allow to assimilate, even though it demands that type of assimilation. And the phrase that keeps coming into my mind, has kept coming into my mind since the pandemic really got going and we started hearing about the anti-Asian incidents, has been the idea of the perpetual foreigner, that no matter how long we've been here, and in this part of the country, we have people who've been here for 5 generations or more, they will never be American, because we will always be seen as not part of this country. And when Andrew Yang said what he said about how we just need to be more American, that was some of the attitude of folks who came out of internment, traumatized by that experience, thinking that we must be more American to keep this from happening. and it didn't stop happening. And there are so many stories of how the former attorneys buried this history because of this trauma and because of this need to try to be as American as we possibly can, and then seeing these patterns of discrimination and these microaggressions and macroaggressions repeat itself. And it was then, you see in the history of Asian America, you see how it's from the reclaiming of this history and from these secrets that you start seeing these movements born for Asian American studies, Asian American movements, which is a plus. And I'm sure we will talk about this soon, but that is that other piece that I keep thinking about, is this perpetual foreigner syndrome where we are demanded to be more American, and yet there is no way we can be. And it's not just us, not just us.
And that demand to be more American goes hand in hand with the erasure of narratives and history and story. Like, we don't talk about those things, let's forget those things and move on.
Exactly.
And so the dearth of knowledge that the average person living in these countries has about that history, there's no place to situate what's happening currently in a longer narrative. And that's a real loss.
And I find that I am combating statements or like memes that people are setting around, people who I think should know better, because on racism or on other justice issues, they know better, but they don't know this history. And so they don't realize what they're sending around is racist, because they don't know the history of anti-Asian racism in the United States.
Yeah, thank you.
So from slightly different perspective, like Second World War, Nazi Germany scapegoated the Jewish people, kind of not admitting the problem inside, but blame shifting. And in a way, I see the same pattern that's happening these days. COVID-19 has hardly anything to do with Asian Americans living in the States. But people are turning their anger or frustration toward Asian Americans, scapegoating. And the majority of the media and also Washington don't bother, because it doesn't hurt them. And it's just frustrating that Asian Americans are, in history, never fully acknowledged as full human being, but kind of a convenience. So we could be model minority if we behave, follow the rule, work hard, contribute. But suddenly, with this coronavirus having slight relevance to some Asian country, now Asians are dehumanized. And what's really interesting is during Second World War in the United States, there was only Japanese internment camp, even though Italy and Germany were on the other side. We don't really hear about rounding up Italians or German origin, citizens in internment camp, because they are one of the European descent white people. They're one of us. But Japanese don't look like us. They don't share our tradition. So it's easy to dehumanize, demonize them. And how many movies about Japanese internment camp is out there? Hardly any.
Right.
How many Holocaust movies out there? Hollywood produces at least one every year. And there's a lot we need to talk about.
We've talked you've talked a little bit about this phrase model minorities. So you brought that into our conversation. Could any of you talk a little bit more about what that term means for people who may not be familiar with it, or for people who may have heard it before but don't exactly know what it means?
And there we go. When I first learned about the phrase model minority, I was still in uni, and was told about something that I already knew about, but I had no words for. And that was this ideal being raised first generation from immigrant parents from the Philippines, that you essentially code switch. You, just like was mentioned earlier, you have to behave a certain way, you have to pay your dues, work hard, not make mistakes. You become, whilst you are a minority, to be a model minority essentially means to be the perfect one who doesn't cause waves. And not only does that require code switching from others, but also requires probably some bit of subscription to a bit of the colonial mindset, and a bit of, this is better, this way is better. And I grew up being very frustrated with questioning what happened to my Filipino diaspora.
Yeah.
What's going on there? So I hope that, does that explain it? I'm sure someone else could probably articulate that better than me.
Anyone else want to weigh in? One of the things that I think of, and I'll keep this short for other people to jump in, but one of the things that I think of from the perspective of an African American who this is the country that I was born in and live in, the sentiment that, while other minority groups have made it, what's wrong with your people? Why can't you? And so the model minority myth filtered down to my community is, well, they were mistreated, or they were foreigners at one time, but they came, and look at them, they're all doctors and lawyers, and what's the matter with you all? And so it becomes a way to pit groups against one another, but also builds up that idea that there's one way for a people to be, right? And that you as individuals are representing the entire diaspora for all time. And that is a pretty tight box to be in, and it's a box that is not true, right? That there's more to an individual than the group that they belong to, but the group that they belong to is an important part of their identity.
Yeah, I agree with you, Regina.
Go ahead.
So, model minority is a very toxic myth that we need to destroy. And as you said, it's a tactic to just divide us minority groups pitted against each other. And when they kind of use that myth to shame African American inner city neighborhood, it's kind of ignoring and denying the history, 400 plus years of history of slavery and the systemic injustice that's still going on today. And it's not just right to use that. The other part is that I've met quite a few Korean Americans and some Chinese Americans who buy into that myth, thinking, yeah, we made it, I worked hard, and without realizing that we also benefited from the history of slavery and ongoing oppression on African Americans. And it's toxic for everybody, but works for the white supremacist power to hold on to the power and not allowing people don't look like them to come and share the pie.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for raising that as well, Regina. What you were speaking to about the, I think it's a direct example. The concept of model minorities, the direct example of how racial groups are pitted against each other, how it stirs competition, division, and lateral violence. And the race discourse is not a matter of white versus non-white. There is a hierarchy that ends up existing, and what results is this constructed racial hierarchy. Minority groups start to fight among each other to seek a higher position on that hierarchy. But I think that what, Sue talked about it a little bit, that this model minority idea, also what ends up happening is it paints a really broad stroke across in terms of, East Asians, and thing is that there's there's a lot of differences in our history. Some of us probably have different history in terms of colonization and oppression, and even now, and so it doesn't honor those different narratives. And it I think what ends up doing as well is that it ends up really hiding a lot of the, as Sue said, the systemic, the institutional and structural challenges that are happening in those communities. Whether it's mental health concerns, it's experiencing poverty and crime. Those get overlooked with the perception of a model minority. But I think Sue also brought up this yellow peril, which is that seems to be existing in duality and in dialectic relationship with yellow peril as fear, and the model minority is like, I don't know, it's like admiration, jealous admiration. But what ends up happening is it creates this, like, it creates I guess to me, what it reveals actually is the belief of the need to conquer or civilize by this white supremacist culture.
Yeah, I really appreciate the way that as you all are speaking, that we are constantly being reminded about the systemic nature of what we're talking about, and the places that it damages individuals and communities. And so when we're talking about economics, when we're talking about policies, like real live actual policies that said, we don't want you here, we're going to move you here and contain you, feeds into that overall project of dehumanization and that hierarchy, right? So it teaches everyone to look out for those people, even if we are those people, and it does result in this what looks like a self-fulfilling prophecy, but it's not self-fulfilling. It is orchestrated and handed down. So we are about 45 minutes in. We have a couple of questions that I want to entertain, but before we get to the questions from people who are listening in on this conversation, if there are things that you haven't said already or that you want to build on about what you would like other people, white people, other people of color, to know, and what kinds of alliances would you like to see built or that you are seeing built? Anything that any of you would want to say to those two things, like going forward, what are the things that you are hoping for, even plotting for, right?
Yeah, so we have the Black History Month, you know, Asian Pacific Islander Month, Hispanic Heritage Month. You know, we have this history that's just chopped up and in silos. And I think we forget like the push-pull factors of how our different groups have been used, right, in maintaining the system. And so we need to break down these silos. And I think this happens, I think for me, I look at as I need to do my history of understanding my own history, history of my parents and the culture where they, you know, from the country where they came from. I need to do I need to do the work of history and learning of Asian Americans here in the United States and seeing the continuity before I came here, right? 40 years before I came here, right? 150 years of history. So there's that identity development that needs to happen within me. And then there has to be this, I'll use my Christian language, like this loving your neighbor thing. And what does that mean when my culture really centers all around my familial ties? So how do I break out of that and recognize, hey, how does this connect rather than just centering on the history that I've learned from the textbooks? That doesn't mention us in any form except one line of the Korean War, right? How do I recognize the different ways that we need to connect with each other and build authentic relationships with each other? Because if we're trying to do big solidarity work for the I guess the purpose of just working on the system, it's not very sustainable. We need to build real, authentic relationships of loving each other, recognizing the pain and the trauma, and finding connections within each other's stories. And so there's like that part. And then the third part, of course, is to work together for the systemic changes. And so I know that there are many people who are doing that, and I'm sure a lot of you guys can give examples of that, but those are the three things that I've been trying to do. Probably it's gonna be a lifelong thing, but I'm excited to do it with people like Regina and others here.
Thanks, Sue. Others?
Yeah, I'd like to say there's so much we can all do, and that starts with self-education. You don't have to go and get a degree necessarily unless you want to, but even just pushing yourself to watch programming outside of what you're used to, reading things. I think when I worked in higher education and academia for 15 years, I became very frustrated. I did grow up raised to be a model minority, raised to believe, do this, pay your dues, pay that brown tax where you're working harder than everyone else. And you will be successful, you will have opportunities, you will be able to save money for a future with your family. And for whatever reason, I kept hitting walls where I'd be hired at new colleges or universities only to go from office pet to office threat, because I would hold people accountable for either microaggressions, blatant racism. Actually, it wasn't until I read this particular article that I knew what that concept was. I think the author's name was Erica Stallings, and I believe the title was "When Black Women Go from Office Pet to Office Threat." When I read that, I thought, "Oh my word, that it's now called something."
Yeah.
You know. And I think even just reading articles like that, starting there, and then also being open to dialogue is very important for everyone.
Yeah.
But also, I think one of the most critical things is also not expecting people of color or of any other groups to speak for to speak for everyone.
Yeah.
Because there are days where I'm like, I would love to answer your question, but I do not have it in me today.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I love what you said about, and I think you mentioned this earlier as well, about getting language that matches an experience that you did not have language for before. And that goes hand in hand, I think, with this call for education. So both education in terms of how do we do education formally, what stories, what narratives do we include, but also our self-education. Do we know our histories and stories? Do we know the histories and stories of the people that we are working with or trying to do something with, and being very intentional about knowing more than we know, because so much has been hidden from us. I'm gonna shift to the couple of questions that we have here. And yeah, just jump in if you have a response to this. So one question says, do you encounter any white people who are aware of this racism and are particularly supportive of you?
and I apologize if I'm taking too much space. Please, anyone feel free to also jump in. The incident that I shared with you about the grocery store the other day, not gonna lie, went home, posted it on Faceplace, just because I needed that outlet. And I did have a lot of friends and family come to my side and say, I'm here for you, I'm here for you. And what I realized, particularly with this incident, was that specifically for my white friends and family, to see their commitment, their ongoing commitment throughout time and our time together, is what has been the most helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Not just in asking questions, but also just listening and just
Mm-hmm.
hearing me out. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to include that, yes, of course, I have white friends, white family who are supportive, but that's not the issue, because they can't stop, my friends being supportive of me and the policies and then the general social acceptance of this kind of these behaviors and these movements toward, within the law and within politics. That's a completely different thing. And so what I need to see, and what we need to see, is more action taken to for policies that are anti-racist, more training that is anti-racist, more education that erases this erasure, and emphasizes these histories that have been covered over, so that we can learn. And I've been thinking about how the word forgiveness comes up in my work a lot, and in this case, and especially in the case of anti-racism training and anti-racism work, there's a real desire to look at forgiveness as in, well, I did this thing, and it's you have to forgive me, it's okay. And I tend to look at forgiveness in a more holistic sort of way of understanding that we are complex and that we have complex histories, and being able to occupy these spaces of having privilege and no privilege, being an oppressor and not an oppressor, of having marginalized others and being marginalized, because we see that a lot within our own communities. And we see that a lot, amid communities, as we were talking about racial hierarchies, that Asian people, Asian Americans, have different privileges and different powers politically than African Americans or Indigenous peoples. And where forgiveness comes into that for me is the recognition that we have, we contain multitudes, we exist in these multiple ways. And then the question is, how do we live in ways where we use our abilities, use our powers to continue to advocate with and for one another, and work with and for one another, so that these aggressions cannot happen again.
Thank you. Okay, so this next question, I think that with the last couple of comments, there's they approach an answer to this question. So I put it out there for if people want to say more. What are some ways that the narrative of what it means to be American can be revised so that the contributions of Asian Americans and other communities made to feel less than American are fully recognized and elevated to equal status? Have you seen any good examples in communities that have embraced the fuller, truer history and contributions?
So I have a neighbor who is a professor at university, and she is part of the she's part of the history department, and it's under American history department, but she teaches Latinx history. And it was really new for me too, because when I was going to school, there was the history department, and then there was Asian American department that was cut off in a different part of the campus. And there is a movement of universities really recognizing the different ethnic studies as part of American history department. And I think as we do that in our educational spaces, I think that's one way that we can recognize that. So that's one thing. I hope that our universities where you guys are at are also doing those kinds of things.
I think also the work around decolonizing is very, very important. I think that's part of, we all spoke about trauma. We all spoke about identity. And I think, there is definitely a link of how our identities have become fractured because of the traumas that we've experienced. And I think that, that there has to be some decolonizing trauma work. And I would love for us to do more work around that. Even for myself, moving to Canada with my family, it felt like it was a colonizing experience all over again, of having to assimilate, having to, in order to get rid of my accent so I could fit in with the rest of the kids and not be made fun of, I had to forget my language. And somehow it also felt like, I'm lucky to be here. So, I should just do that. And, but I think that now I'm trying to connect to a culture, to a way of being that was always rightfully mine, and to have had to give that up as a way of taking on a national identity. And so I feel like there has, I would love for us to have more opportunities, and not be in silos, but opportunities to perhaps do some decolonizing work together. Because I think despite all the different experiences of colonization and oppression, I think there is a collective experience of harm that's happened, and that's something that we can support each other in. And I think that that's a place that perhaps, there could be more spaces around that.
Yeah. I'm the next question, I think you have in your responses have spoken to this question of how can we take this current situation and use it to open up dialogue to mend bridges and unite Asian American community with other minority communities now and in the future. Here is a comment that says, I wonder if you all are educating your fellow people of color just how much Black excellence is pretty much the same as model minorities. So yeah, there is that language within the African American community that gets at that same sentiment. And then the person goes on to say, I find that the change in words usually creates a disconnect between folks. And so what you all have said about recognizing the ways in which our narratives, even though they are different from one another and distinct from one another, there are parallels and connections. And if we are given the space and the opportunity to find those connections, we can build something out of that. Here's a question: how are you all carrying and or caring for yourselves in the midst of this? How can we practitioners journey with you and support you?
If I can, I will answer that, but I also wanted to support what you said in terms of language. I think it is very important to invest time in trying to understand and learn how language is used in so many different ways in the context of race and identity, especially if there's multiple intersectionalities for the individuals in our lives. For example, the other day I had to explain to a friend of mine who identifies as Black British why the friends that I introduced them to from America all identify differently. Whether it's one friend that says, I'm Black, don't call me anything else. I have another friend who said, I'm Caribbean American, I'm African American. That's how I choose to identify. And to take advantage of those opportunities to help educate others, with the utmost respect and patience, and also to be fearless in asking questions. Why do you identify as this? I think that I know a lot of what I'm sharing is very much on a basic level, but that when I was working with my students or even with my clients now, that's where I help them start on the most basic everyday things that they can do. And what was the question? The last question again? I'm so sorry.
How are you caring for yourself, and how can other people support the self-care that we all need to be doing in these days?
My self-care comes in the form of comfort food, whether that's making some homemade American food, Filipino food, but I think one of the best ways to support others is to really just check in. Just check in. When I got home and I posted what I posted online, not only did I have an outpour of support online, but I did have friends and family who called me and said, I just want to validate that pain. I'm here for you to heal with. And let me carry some of that with you because I understand, because I've felt it myself. So check in with people.
Absolutely. I would say also intervene. When you see stuff going down in the store, in your neighborhood, when people are posting weird stuff on social media and you know them and you have a relationship with them, call it out. Like I think, yeah, I think that bystander intervention is really critical in these days, and stepping in and standing up for one another when we see, like all of you gave examples of things that are just like happening like out in public, like out in the open. And when people assume that it's not going to be challenged, that gives it more energy. And so for me, that's one of the things that I would say is step up and call out. Yeah, Richard.
If I can add to that, first of all, I love that bystander intervention is so very important. But if anyone's ever questioning, should I say something? Should I step up? Should I show up? The feeling that you have later when you realize you could have done something and you chose not to is something you'll never forget. That may help some people make the decision to speak up.
And I think especially with other people of color, this is really important. We need to show up for each other. And it's most disheartening when I see other people of color not stepping up or speaking for And it is the most encouraging thing when I get notes or emails or texts from my friends of color who say, I see you, I'm here for you, I got your back. That has been the most encouraging note. So us showing up for each other as communities of color, I think is particularly important. I've been dancing to try to keep myself, because I think when we do a lot of trauma work, we embody that, right? We hold it and we don't even know that that we're feeling and experiencing, holding all that in. And so I'm not a good dancer, but I've been moving about, and I've been doing some Zumbaing and getting some different music going, and taking breaks to really just connect with my body. So that's some of the work that I've been doing, just more creative work to keep myself feeling and being present as much as I can, instead of trying to avoid what's happening, just practicing mindfulness and just being fully present of what's happening, and learning to articulate, whether that's expressing it, through my movements or writing it down. I'm not a good writer, but I'm like, I need to write this. This is a discipline that I need to hone at this time.
So I have one more question, comment that I will give to the group. And this question it's a hard one, and it is sort of at the other end of the spectrum with what we were just talking about, with communities coming together and supporting one another and standing up. So this person says, as an African American, I don't know how to move beyond the negative feelings that I have with the Asian community regarding their negative feelings towards the African American community. How do we move forward together with the negative feelings between our groups? And that's some hard but necessary work that I think has to happen. So I don't know if you all want to speak to that. I know that that's a hard question, but it's a real one, right? The ways that we have been pitted together, and the ways that our communities have acted out, or other communities have acted out on our communities, that's real stuff, right? And it all benefits, as you all have said, the system of white supremacy, but the impact of it is it's there, right? So I don't know if people have responses to that.
Okay, so I live in the predominantly African American inner city neighborhood in Philadelphia, known as North Philly. And this is 94% African American neighborhood. And recently, gentrification is happening, but up till like 10 years ago, the only Asian people that my neighbors encountered were store owners, beauty supply, corner store, beer deli, in a beer shop. And, I totally understand that question, because usually the relationship between the Asian business owners in inner city neighborhood and those clients who are using these shops were not good. But I don't think there's any easy solution, but I think first, probably you need to ask questions like, why are they doing business here? As poor immigrant without much capital and without much life skill or training, inner city neighborhood is the only place they could start their business. So as African American, poor African American ended up kind of being quarantined in inner city neighborhood, the same way these poor immigrants ended up having to do business in inner city neighborhood. So both groups are forced to live or do business in this kind of poor neighborhood. So instead of just focusing on that problem that's just in front of themselves, we need to step back and see the bigger picture and realize that both groups, the Asian Americans and African Americans, are victims of the imperialism or colonialism that is going on. And kind of when they start to have a dialogue, and instead of suspicion and doubt and hostility, as they begin to kind of retell the stories of their own coming and the orders of their life and the challenge of life, I think you could begin to kind of change that. And each group needs to do that on their own, kind of seeing their own prejudice against the other group. But at the same time, you need to have that kind of personal relationship and conversation on that dynamic. And it just takes first step. And you need to begin to see each other as a friend or neighbor. And one by one, I think that could kind of shift. Like, you know, I've been living in this neighborhood since 2003. And as Regina, you introduced, I've been running summer camp. So in my neighborhood, at least, they have a pretty positive view toward Asian Americans. And it's the same with a whole bunch of Asian American volunteers who come to my neighborhood every summer. So that relationship is breaking down that hostility and the racial wall that is built. So I'm speaking also from my own experience.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that. Friends, I want to honor the time that we said we would have on this call. We've been going a little over an hour. I really appreciate you being on the panel, the 5 of you being on the panel and sharing with us. I appreciate those that are listening in that have forwarded questions to us, that are all of you who are, all of us on this call care about what is happening. We really appreciate you. Thank you for being here. This is the first in a series of dialogues that we hope to have. Stay tuned. You can check out the Facebook page for Roots of Justice or the website to find out what's going on. I believe that there will be a recording of this for people who missed it. And one person, before we go, one person somewhere in this thread asked if they could put out a call for papers, and I can't find it right now, but I'm gonna ask that person to please forward it to us via the Facebook page or the website so that we can get that information out to you. Thank you, friends, so much for being a part of this. It was a really fruitful hour. I have enjoyed getting to know each of you and talk to you. Thank you so much for the time. Thanks, everybody. We are going to sign off now. This is always the awkward part of a Zoom call, right? How do we actually leave? Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening. And Richard, go to bed.